Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the year 1347. The medieval world is at its height. Cities are growing. Trade flourishes along routes connecting Europe to Asia. Cathedrals soar toward heaven, and the population has recovered from earlier famines to reach levels not seen since Roman times. In our timeline, this prosperity was about to end in the most horrific way imaginable. Ships arriving from the east brought not just silk and spices, but also black rats carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Within 5 years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population would be dead, entire villages emptied, families destroyed, and the medieval world shattered beyond repair. But what if those ships never arrived? What if the plague, by some chance of wind or wave, how would history have unfolded without this catastrophic demographic collapse? Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let us explore this alternate timeline together. Imagine a medieval Europe that continues to grow and thrive, where the population explosion of the 13th century never faces a devastating correction, where feudalism evolves differently without the labor shortages that empowered peasants, where the church maintains authority not shaken by the failure of prayers to stop the plague, and where the entire trajectory of Western civilization follows a different path. Rest now and journey with me through a world where death did not ride across Europe on a pale horse, where medieval civilization matured and transformed without the trauma of mass death. The crucial difference to understand how Europe might have developed without the Black Death, we must first understand what the plague changed. The pandemic did more than kill millions. It fundamentally restructured European society, economics, and culture in ways that shaped everything that followed. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated relative to its agricultural capacity. The medieval warm period had allowed population growth, but by the early 14th century, the continent was pushing against Malthusian limits. Marginal lands were being farmed with poor returns. Forests were cleared to breaking point, and periodic famines revealed the fragility of the food supply. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 had already demonstrated that Europe's population had outgrown its resources. The Black Death solved this problem through mass death. Survivors inherited property, consolidated holdings, and faced a seller's market for their labor. Peasants who had been bound to the land as serfs found they could demand wages, negotiate better conditions, or simply move to where opportunities were better. Land values plummeted while labor costs soared. The feudal system, based on tied peasant labor, began to crumble. Lords who refused to adapt found their lands abandoned as peasants fled to cities or to lords offering better terms. In our alternate timeline, none of this happens. The ships from Kaffa carrying plague-infected rats sink in a storm in the Black Sea, or perhaps the disease burns itself out before reaching Europe, or maybe European quarantine measures, implemented after earlier, smaller outbreaks, successfully contain the infection. Whatever the specific mechanism, Europe in 1347 does not face pandemic. Ships arrive with normal goods and normal problems. The autumn harvest is gathered, the winter passes in typical hardship, and spring 1348 arrives without the horror of plague pits and abandoned villages. Medieval prosperity continues without the demographic catastrophe. 14th century Europe continues its trajectory of growth and development. The population, estimated at perhaps 75 million in 1300, continues to increase. By 1400, it reaches 90 million. By 1450, over 100 million people live in Europe, levels that in our timeline would not be reached until the 16th century. This population growth creates challenges but also opportunities. The agricultural innovations of the High Middle Ages, the heavy plow, the three-field system, the horse collar, continue to spread and improve. But with more mouths to feed in finite arable land, European society must become more efficient. Investment flows into agriculture. Better tools, more systematic crop rotation, drainage of marshlands, terracing of hillsides. The pressure of population forces innovation in ways that the post-plague depopulation did not. Cities grow larger than they did in our timeline. Paris, London, Milan, Florence, and other urban centers swell with people seeking opportunity. These cities face the problems of medieval urbanization, sanitation, fire hazards, crime, disease, but they also become centers of innovation, trade, and culture. The urban middle-class merchants, craftsmen, professionals grows in number and influence. Guilds become more powerful, regulating trades and negotiating with nobility and clergy for urban rights and privileges. The feudal system persists but evolves under different pressures than in our timeline. Without the labor shortage caused by the plague, lords maintain more control over their peasants. Serfdom continues in many regions, though the most oppressive aspects are gradually moderated as peasants find ways to leverage what limited bargaining power they have. Revolts still occur. Peasant rebellions were common in the 14th century, even before the plague, but without the post-plague context that made labor so valuable, these revolts are more easily suppressed. The Church unchallenged. One of the most profound effects of the Black Death in our timeline was the blow it struck to church authority. When prayers failed to stop the plague, when priests died at higher rates than lay people because they administered last rites to the dying, and when the Church's explanations for the catastrophe seemed inadequate, popular faith was shaken. The late medieval period saw increasing skepticism toward church authority, greater interest in mysticism and personal religious experience, and eventually the Protestant Reformation. In our alternate timeline, the Church faces no such crisis of confidence. Its authority remains intact, its explanations for the world order unchallenged by apocalyptic pandemic. The 14th century Church is wealthy, powerful, and deeply integrated into every aspect of European life. It owns perhaps 1/3 of Europe's land, collects tithes from virtually everyone, and exercises both spiritual and temporal authority. Without the shock of the plague, the abuses that led to the Reformation developed more slowly or are addressed through internal reform. The papal schism still occurs. This was driven by French-Italian political conflicts rather than the plague, but the Church emerges from it less damaged than in our timeline. Critics like John Wycliffe and Jan, who still raise theological challenges, but without the broader crisis of confidence created by the plague, their ideas gain less traction. The Church of the 15th century in our alternate timeline is more confident, more unified, and more successful at maintaining its monopoly on religious authority in Western Europe. This has profound implications for the development of European thought. The questioning spirit that emerged partly from the plague's challenge to religious certainty develops differently or more slowly. The Protestant Reformation, if it occurs at all, happens later and perhaps less dramatically. The religious wars that tore Europe apart in the 16th and 17th centuries might be avoided, or at least mitigated. Periodic famines still occur when harvests fail, though they are less catastrophic than the Great Famine of 1315–1317 because improved techniques provide some buffer. Still, the specter of hunger haunts the medieval European world in a way that survivors of the Black Death never experienced. This creates a society that is simultaneously more technologically advanced in agriculture and more precarious, always one bad harvest away from crisis. The crowded city's urban Europe in this alternate 15th century is dramatically different from our timeline. Cities that reached perhaps 50,000 inhabitants in actual history now swelled to 100,000 or more. London, which had 40,000 people before the plague and took centuries to recover those numbers in our timeline, has over 120,000 by 1450. Paris exceeds 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The great Italian cities, Florence, Milan, Venice, Genoa, are metropolises by medieval standards, their populations dense and diverse. These crowded cities face challenges that medieval infrastructure was never designed to handle. Waste disposal, always a problem in medieval cities, becomes critical. The narrow streets run with sewage and garbage, creating conditions ripe for disease even without the plague. Fires are constant threats, with wooden buildings packed tightly together. Crime flourishes in crowded, poorly policed neighborhoods. The air is thick with smoke from thousands of hearths and workshops. Yet from these challenges come innovations. Cities invest in infrastructure that would not be developed for generations in our timeline. Public fountains and wells multiply, fed by aqueducts and cisterns inspired by Roman engineering. Wider streets are mandated for new construction, and regulations require stone or brick rather than timber for buildings over certain sizes. Night watches patrol more systematically. Public health measures, primitive by modern standards but sophisticated for the medieval period, attempt to control epidemic disease through quarantine and sanitation. The urban middle class grows larger and more powerful than in our timeline. With more people and more economic activity, merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, physicians, and other professionals form a substantial portion of urban populations. They organize into guilds and corporations that negotiate with nobility and clergy for rights and privileges. Urban councils gain more authority, sometimes approaching self-governance under nominal noble or royal oversight. This urban bourgeoisie, existing earlier and in greater numbers than in our timeline, will eventually challenge the feudal order more effectively than peasants ever could. The persistence of feudalism in the countryside, the feudal system proves more durable without the plague's disruption. Lords maintain control over their peasants through a combination of legal obligation, military force, and economic dependency. Serfdom, which was already declining in some regions before the plague and collapsed rapidly afterward in our timeline, persists throughout most of Europe. Peasants remain tied to the land, obligated to provide labor services and subject to manorial courts controlled by their lords. However, feudalism without the plague is not identical to pre-plague feudalism. The system adapts to manage larger populations and more complex economic relationships. Money rents increasingly supplement or replace labor services as lords find it more efficient to hire workers or invest in improvements rather than relying on forced peasant labor. Peasants with cash crops, wool, wine, specialized agricultural products gain some economic leverage even while remaining legally unfree. Regional differences become more pronounced. In Eastern Europe, where population pressure is less severe and land more abundant, feudalism actually intensifies, with lords imposing harsher conditions on peasants in a process historians call the Second Serfdom. In Western Europe, particularly in England, the Low Countries, and parts of France and Italy, economic forces gradually erode the most oppressive aspects of serfdom, even as the legal framework persists. By 1450, a complex patchwork of regional variations exists, with some areas moving toward freer labor markets while others reinforce traditional feudal bonds. Peasant revolts continue to erupt periodically, as they did throughout the medieval period. But without the post-plague context that made labor scarce and valuable, these revolts are more easily suppressed. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, which in our timeline was partly driven by attempts to reimpose pre-plague labor conditions on emboldened peasants, either doesn't occur or takes a different form. Peasant grievances are real: heavy taxation, arbitrary justice, economic exploitation. But lords have less reason to compromise when labor is abundant and cheap. Cultural flowering. The 15th century in our alternate timeline sees a remarkable cultural flowering earlier and in some ways richer than the Renaissance that actually occurred after the plague. With larger urban populations, more concentrated wealth, and continued church patronage, the arts and learning thrive in ways they could not in depopulated post-plague Europe. The universities, which suffered during the plague as students and masters died, continue to grow without interruption. Oxford, Paris, Bologna, and Salamanca expand, training not just clergy but also lawyers, physicians, and scholars. New universities are founded more rapidly than in our timeline, as growing cities demand educated professionals. By 1450, dozens of universities operate across Europe, creating an intellectual class larger than anything the medieval world had previously known. This intellectual flowering combines continued medieval scholasticism with early stirrings of humanist thought. The recovery of classical texts, which accelerated after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 in our timeline, begins earlier as Italian scholars maintain stronger connections with the Byzantine Empire that, in this timeline, is somewhat stronger without the plague having weakened it. Greek and Roman classics are studied alongside Christian theology, creating a synthesis of ancient and medieval thought. Artistic production flourishes with patronage from the church, nobility, and increasingly wealthy urban merchants. The Gothic style reaches its ultimate expression in cathedrals that are larger and more ornate than in our timeline, employing armies of craftsmen and artists. Painting, sculpture, and manuscript illumination are practiced by thousands of skilled artisans in dozens of cities. The technical innovations that produced the Renaissance in our timeline, perspective, oil painting, realistic portraiture, developed somewhat earlier, driven by competition among artists in crowded urban markets where innovation attracts patronage. Literature expands beyond the clerical and aristocratic circles that dominated earlier medieval writing. With higher literacy rates, though still only a small percentage of the population, and more urban readers, vernacular literature flourishes. Poetry, romances, chronicles, and practical manuals find audiences willing to pay scribes to copy text. The printing press, invented in the 1450s in both timelines, has an even more dramatic impact in this more populous, more literate Europe, spreading rapidly and producing books in unprecedented quantities. Technology and innovation. The technological development of 15th century Europe without the plague follows different paths than in our timeline. The labor-saving innovations that the post-plague labor shortage encouraged develop more slowly. But other technologies, driven by population pressure and abundant labor, advance more rapidly. Mining expands dramatically to meet the demands of growing urban populations for metals and fuel. Deeper mines require better pumping technology to remove water, driving innovations in mechanical engineering. The development of blast furnaces, which can produce cast iron, proceeds faster than in our timeline because there are more workers available for the labor-intensive processes involved and more demand for metal products from larger populations. Shipbuilding advances as European merchants seek to trade over greater distances to access resources and markets. The caravel, the ship that will enable the age of exploration, is refined and improved. Maritime technologies like the compass, astrolabe, and improved maps spread more widely among more numerous mariners. The fishing fleets that feed Europe's coastal cities grow larger and venture further, beginning to systematically exploit the rich fishing grounds of the North Atlantic. Textile production, always important to the medieval economy, becomes even more central. The demand for cloth from larger populations drives expansion of wool production, flax cultivation, and the textile workshops of Flanders, Italy, and England. Water mills and later windmills are adapted to power textile machinery, increasing production efficiency. These innovations in textile manufacturing foreshadow the Industrial Revolution that will come centuries later. Europe retains a common cultural and intellectual framework longer than in our timeline. The Renaissance flows into the scientific revolution with less disruption. The Catholic Church, while adapting to new intellectual currents more slowly than competing Protestant churches did in our timeline, nonetheless accommodates scientific inquiry because it faces less existential threat. Galileo might still face church censure, but perhaps not trial and house arrest because the church feels secure enough to tolerate some degree of intellectual independence. The scientific revolution, the 16th and 17th centuries, witnessed the birth of modern science, and in our alternate timeline, this revolution unfolds in a different context. The larger population means more potential scholars and scientists. Universities are more numerous and better funded than should. Patronage for learning comes from the church, monarchs, nobles, and wealthy merchants. The printing press, invented around 1450 in both timelines, has even greater impact in this more populous Europe. More readers create demand for more books, and more books spread knowledge faster. Scientific works circulate widely, allowing scholars across Europe to build on each other's discoveries rapidly. The Republic of Letters, the informal network of scientists and intellectuals who corresponded and shared ideas, is larger and more active than in our timeline. Key discoveries proceed along similar lines to our history. Copernicus proposes his heliocentric model. Galileo improves the telescope and observes the moons of Jupiter. Kepler describes planetary motion. Harvey describes blood circulation. Newton develops his laws of motion and gravitation. But these discoveries spread faster and are built upon more quickly because there are simply more scientists, more universities, and more resources devoted to scholarship. The practical applications of scientific knowledge develop somewhat faster as well. The scientific approach to agriculture, navigation, manufacturing, and medicine gains more rapid acceptance because population pressure makes efficiency crucial. Experimentation with crop rotation, livestock breeding, and land management becomes more systematic as landowners desperately seek to increase yields. Mining and metallurgy advance as European demand for metals grows and colonies provide new sources of ore. The Ottoman challenge in our timeline, the Ottoman Empire reached its peak in the 16th century before beginning a long decline that accelerated after repeated wars with European powers. In our alternate timeline, the dynamics of Ottoman-European relations differ significantly because Europe is stronger, more united, and more populous. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 still occurs, ending the Byzantine Empire. But the subsequent Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe faces stiffer resistance. The kingdoms of Hungary, Poland, and Austria can field larger armies from their greater populations. The Mediterranean powers, Venice, Spain, and the Papal States, commit more resources to naval warfare against Ottoman expansion. The result is a stalemate rather than Ottoman ascendancy. The Ottomans control the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean but cannot push further into Central Europe. The Great Ottoman Sieges, Vienna in 1529 and again in 1683 in our timeline, either fail more decisively or never occur because Ottoman power is checked earlier. This changes the trajectory of Eastern European history significantly, with less Ottoman cultural influence and different patterns of religious and ethnic settlement. The Mediterranean, rather than becoming an Ottoman lake as it threatened to in our timeline, remains contested. This allows Italian city-states to maintain their trading networks longer and delays the shift of European economic power to the Atlantic ports. Venice, Genoa, and other Mediterranean commercial powers remain important into the 17th century, creating a more balanced European economic geography. Population continues to grow by 1600. Europe's population approaches 150 million, far exceeding any levels in our timeline until the 18th century. This massive population creates a civilization of unprecedented scale and complexity by pre-modern standards. Cities that were major urban centers with 50,000 people in our timeline now hold 200,000 or more. London exceeds 300,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world alongside Constantinople, Edo, and Beijing. Managing this population requires increasingly sophisticated governance and infrastructure. Water supply, waste disposal, food distribution, public order, all these challenges are met with solutions that in our timeline wouldn't be developed for another century. Centralized monarchies grow stronger as they develop bureaucracies capable of administering larger populations. Taxation becomes more systematic and efficient. Standing armies replace feudal levies, funded by taxes on the growing commercial economy. The environmental impact is severe. Europe's forests, already depleted, continue to shrink as demand for timber for construction, shipbuilding, and fuel grows. Some regions face ecological crisis as soil erosion from overfarming becomes critical. This drives technological substitution. Coal replaces wood for fuel. Brick replaces timber for construction, earlier than in our timeline. The English, lacking forest but having abundant coal, begin the transition to a coal-based economy in the late 1500s, nearly 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution in our timeline. The Industrial Revolution, which transformed human civilization more profoundly than perhaps any event since the invention of agriculture, unfolds earlier and more intensively in this alternate timeline. The combination of resource scarcity, abundant labor, accumulated capital, and technological readiness creates conditions ripe for industrial transformation by the late 17th century, decades before our timeline's revolution beginning in the 1760s. England leads the way, as it did in our history, but for somewhat different reasons. The island nation, with limited agricultural land but abundant coal deposits, has been transitioning to coal-based energy since the late 1500s out of sheer necessity. By 1680, English cities heat their homes with coal, and English industries increasingly use coal for power. When steam engine technology matures in the 1690s, earlier than James Watt's improvements in the 1760s in our timeline, England is perfectly positioned to exploit it. The first steam engines pump water from deep coal mines, allowing extraction from depths impossible with earlier technology. But inventors quickly adapt the technology to other uses, powering textile mills, driving blast furnaces, grinding grain. By 1720, steam power is transforming English manufacturing, creating production capacities that dwarf anything the medieval world imagined. The coal-powered factories of the English Midlands employ thousands of workers, producing textiles, iron goods, and ceramics in unprecedented quantities. The transformation spreads to other European nations with coal resources: the German states, Belgium, northern France. Nations without coal, Italy, Spain, much of Scandinavia, struggled to compete, creating new patterns of economic inequality within Europe. The great Mediterranean trading cities that dominated medieval commerce find themselves relegated to secondary importance as economic power shifts to the industrial centers of Northern Europe. The price of progress, the Industrial Revolution in this timeline, unfolds in a context of cheap, abundant labor that creates conditions even more brutal than the harsh realities of industrialization in our history. With Europe's population exceeding 200 million by 1750, workers have almost no bargaining power. Factory owners can impose conditions that would have been impossible in post-plague Europe, where labor scarcity gave workers some leverage. The factories are hellish places: 14 or 16-hour workdays, dangerous machinery, toxic fumes, child labor starting at age 6 or 7, wages kept at bare subsistence levels. Housing for workers is squalid, with entire families crammed into single rooms in tenements built as cheaply as possible. Urban pollution from coal smoke and industrial waste creates public health crises that kill thousands. Life expectancy in industrial cities actually declines from rural levels, even as overall production and national wealth increase dramatically. The social consequences are explosive. Workers organize first in secret societies and later in open unions, demanding better conditions and political rights. Strikes and protests erupt regularly, sometimes turning violent as workers and factory owners clash. Socialist and communist ideologies, which in our timeline emerged partly in response to industrial conditions, appear earlier and gain stronger followings. By the 1780s, revolutionary movements threaten the established order across industrial Europe. The response from governments and industrialists is initially repressive. Unions are banned, strikes are broken by force, and protest leaders are imprisoned or executed. But gradually, pragmatic reforms emerge. Some factory owners realize that better treated workers are more productive and less rebellious. Governments institute minimal labor regulations, limits on child labor, basic safety standards, restrictions on work hours. These reforms are grudging and insufficient, but they acknowledge that pure exploitation of abundant labor has social costs that even autocratic regimes must address. Political transformation. The late 18th and early 19th centuries see political revolutions that reshape European governance, but in different forms than in our timeline. The French Revolution still occurs, driven by fiscal crisis, social inequality, and Enlightenment ideals. But in a France of 40 million people rather than the 28 million of our 1789, the revolution is even more radical and violent. The masses mobilized are larger, the grievances deeper, and the fear of the privileged classes more intense. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that follow impact a Europe that is more populous and more industrialized than in our timeline. Armies number in the hundreds of thousands, equipped with weapons produced in quantities only industrial manufacturing can provide. The wars are correspondingly more destructive, with casualties exceeding anything seen before. When peace finally comes, Europe is exhausted but also transformed. Monarchies weakened, nationalism strengthened, and the old feudal order definitively ended. The democratic and liberal movements that emerge in the 19th century face complex dynamics. On one hand, larger urban populations and more literate working classes create pressure for political representation. On the other hand, the elite's fear of mob rule is intensified by the sheer numbers involved. The result is a gradual, grudging expansion of political rights that varies greatly by country. England develops its parliamentary democracy incrementally, extending the franchise slowly over decades. France oscillates between republic, empire, and monarchy. Germany and Italy unify later and under more autocratic forms than in our timeline. Eastern Europe remains largely autocratic, with traditional monarchies adapting just enough to survive. The imperial competition, the 19th century's imperial expansion, reaches even greater intensity in this timeline. European nations with their larger populations can deploy more soldiers, settlers, and administrators to control vast colonial empires. The ideological conflicts, fascism versus democracy versus communism, play out in a Europe with more resources, more people, and more destructive technology. The Holocaust, that greatest of human evils, claims even more lives when applied to a Europe with larger Jewish populations. The atomic bombs that end the war in Asia demonstrate humanity's capacity for unprecedented destruction, a sobering reality for a world of over 2 billion people. Yet from these catastrophes, lessons are learned. The post-war period sees determined efforts to prevent future conflicts through international institutions, economic cooperation, and the gradual development of European unity. The memory of two devastating wars, each worse than anything the medieval or early modern periods produced, creates powerful incentives for peace and cooperation that gradually overcome centuries of national rivalries. The modern European Federation today, in our alternate timeline, Europe has evolved into a federated system more integrated than the European Union of our actual world. The sheer population, over 400 million people in the historical European core, necessitates cooperation on resources, environment, and governance that transcends traditional national boundaries. The European Federation, formalized in the late 20th century, provides common institutions while preserving national and regional identities. The landscape of modern Europe reflects 15 centuries of continuous development without the plague's demographic rupture. Cities that were already ancient in the 14th century have grown into vast metropolitan areas. London exceeds 15 million inhabitants, Paris 12 million, and dozens of other cities surpass 2 million. These urban centers are marvels of modern infrastructure, extensive metro systems, vertical gardens on skyscrapers, renewable energy networks, and sophisticated systems for managing waste, water, and transportation. Yet the environmental challenges are severe. Europe's forests were largely eliminated centuries ago, replaced by managed tree farms that provide timber but lack ecological diversity. Agricultural land shows the effects of 1,000 years of intensive farming, requiring heavy inputs of fertilizers and careful management to maintain productivity. The transition to renewable energy begun in the late 20th century proceeds urgently because Europe's population and industry have exhausted most accessible fossil fuel reserves. The social systems that govern this modern Europe emerged from centuries of labor struggle and gradual reform. Universal health care, education, and social security are taken for granted, hard-won victories from generations of workers who fought for dignity and rights. Democracy, while imperfect, is firmly established, with proportional representation systems ensuring that the diverse populations have voice in governance. The extreme inequality of the 19th century has been reduced, though not eliminated, through progressive taxation and welfare states. The weight of numbers Europe's large population creates advantages but also significant challenges. The abundant human capital means exceptional innovation in science, technology, arts, and culture. European universities are among the world's best, European industries are highly productive, and European cultural exports influence global trends. The density of population creates efficiencies in infrastructure and services that less densely populated regions cannot match. But the same population density creates problems. Housing is expensive and often cramped, with many people living in conditions that would seem claustrophobic to Americans or Australians. Privacy is limited, and the constant presence of crowds is an inescapable part of urban life. The ecological footprint of 400 million Europeans living modern consumer lifestyles strains resources despite efficiency improvements and technological solutions. Immigration has become a contentious issue as people from less developed regions seek opportunities in prosperous Europe. The debate over how many immigrants can be absorbed, how integration should occur, and what cultural changes are acceptable mirrors discussions in our timeline, but with higher stakes given the already dense population. Some argue Europe has reached its carrying capacity and must limit growth. Others point out that the continent has sustained even larger populations in the past and that the real issue is distribution of resources rather than absolute numbers. Would the world be better? As we approach the end of this alternate history, we must confront a difficult question. Is this world without the Black Death better or worse than our own? The answer is far from clear, and different people would judge differently based on their values and circumstances. On one hand, averting the plague saved tens of millions of lives from horrific suffering. The medieval civilization that took centuries to build continued its development without the traumatic interruption of mass death. Cultural and technological continuity was maintained, possibly accelerating progress in some areas. The Renaissance and scientific revolution occurred in a more stable context, potentially enabling discoveries and innovations that took longer in our disrupted timeline. On the other hand, the post-plague world in our timeline saw improvements in living standards for survivors, greater social mobility, and the eventual breakdown of feudalism's most oppressive aspects. The labor shortage empowered workers in ways that abundant labor never could. The questioning of authority that the plague sparked may have contributed to the intellectual ferment that produced the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and eventually, modern democracy. The world after the plague, while diminished in numbers, may have been in some ways more dynamic and open to change than the uninterrupted medieval civilization of this alternate timeline. Moreover, the environmental impact of 6 additional centuries of higher population cannot be ignored. Europe in our timeline had time to recover ecologically during the post-plague period of reduced population. In this alternate world, that recovery never occurred, and the cumulative impact of human activity is far more severe. The sustainability challenges facing this alternate Europe are daunting, raising questions about whether the current prosperity can be maintained for future generations. Conclusion: sleep in a crowded world as this long journey through an alternate history comes to its end, and as sleep beckons, let your mind rest with the images and ideas we have explored together. Picture medieval Europe at its height. Cities bustling with life, cathedrals rising toward heaven, fields carefully tended by generations who never faced the terror of plague. See the centuries unfold. Renaissance artists creating masterpieces in more numerous workshops. Explorers crossing oceans to find new lands for Europe's growing millions. Industrial chimneys rising to power a transformation that comes earlier and more intensely. Imagine the modern cities of this alternate Europe. Dense, efficient, bustling with life, ancient streets widened and adapted to modern needs, but still bearing the marks of centuries. See the 400 million people of modern Europe going about their lives, connected by history to ancestors who survived and thrived through 2,000 years without the catastrophic interruption of pandemic. This is a world where death did not ride, where the pale horse never crossed Europe, where medieval civilization matured and evolved without trauma. It is a world of greater numbers, earlier advancement, and different challenges. Whether it is better or worse than our own, we cannot truly say. But imagining it helps us understand how much history hinges on contingency, how a single event or its absence can ripple through centuries, changing everything. Let these thoughts lull you into peaceful rest. Whether in this world or that alternate one, the human story continues. People loving and losing, building and destroying, hoping and fearing, always seeking to understand their place in the vast sweep of time. The Black Death was one of history's great catastrophes, killing millions and reshaping civilizations. But in imagining a world without it, we see both what was lost in that tragedy and what emerged from its aftermath. Sleep now, in whatever world you inhabit, knowing that history is not inevitable, that the paths not taken are as instructive as the roads we walked, and that understanding alternate possibilities helps us appreciate the strange and winding journey that brought us to the present moment. Rest peacefully, and may your dreams carry you through the centuries, seeing all the worlds that might have been. Good night.